computer. Great. Okay.
Got it.
Okay.
Okay. Now, so this evening's speaker is Dr. Melissa Ingala DeWaal. She is the assistant professor and professor at Fairleigh Dickinson University. You're all here for her BAT program. It's going to be bats of the northeastern forests. So even if you're not in New Jersey, if you're somewhere kind of east of the Mississippi, I'm sure it's going to be somewhat relevant. And it's a wonderful program. I have seen it before. Melissa is super, super informative. She does bat research also in the tropics. We're going to learn a lot about bats. We're going to unlearn some of the things that we probably learned as kids that we shouldn't have. And hopefully by the end of the presentation, we're all going to feel that bats are warm and, fuzzy, and we really enjoy them. So, Melissa, all yours.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, Donna. Let me just pull up my slides here in the background, and hopefully Donna won't be bored. This might be her third time seeing this exact program. Uh, so, but welcome everybody to getting to know your local New Jersey bats. So, just to let you know, the way that I like to run this program is more like a conversation or a dialogue. So, if you have questions at any point, just feel free to chime in. Like, don't hold your questions to the end. I spend all day lecturing students who have blank expressions, so it's really nice to interact with people who are a little bit more engaged with what I have to say. So as Donna mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at Fairleigh Dickinson University, and I have been studying bats for probably a decade now. So I've gotten to know them quite well over the years. So just to give you a little bit of background, like how I came to study bats over the past decade, I started out as an undergraduate student at Fordham University, and I wasn't innately interested in bats as a child. I thought they were cool, but I had no special affinity towards them until I started working on a project in a lab that studied bats as part of a research rotation I had to do for my undergraduate thesis, which would later become part of my master's thesis. And then I decided that I loved bats so much that I was going to continue to study them forever and ever and ever. And so far, that has been true. So I decided to do a PhD studying bats at the American Museum of Natural History, where I got to do a lot more field work that wasn't available to me during my undergrad and master's. So this is a picture of me smiling real big because I caught a disc-wing bat in the Peruvian Amazon, which was a species in a family of bats that I'd never seen before. And just as a quick disclaimer, a lot of the photos that I'm in might show me not wearing gloves or a mask because those photos were taken prior to the coronavirus pandemic when that wasn't actually part of the best practices for working with bats in the wild. So if you see photos of me handling bats without gloves and masks, just know that ever since 2020, that has become kind of the standard way to interact with wildlife. So my research areas within bat biology are mostly around the microbiology and natural history of bats. I'm really interested in why there are so many of them and how they do all the really cool things they do. And as a person whose other training is in microbiology, I try to understand these things through the lens of the bacteria that colonize their bodies. So most of the time, you can find me in a place that looks a lot like this. And I know what you're thinking. What part of New Jersey is that? And it's not. So my main field site is down in Central America in Belize, which is a seasonally dry tropical forest. So most of the year, I'm here teaching students, but for 2 weeks a year, I get to live the dream and go to the field and interact with lots of different bats in the wild. So this is one of the interesting little tools that we use to capture bats, and we use that here in the Northeast to study bats in addition to the tropics. It's called a harp trap, and you can't really even make it out in this image, but basically what you have up here is a couple of offset panels of monofilament, like fishing line. And so basically you have a panel like this, and behind it you'll have another one. So when the bats try to tuck their wings and make it through the first panel, they hit the strings on the second panel and fall down into the canvas bag where we can collect them. So this is a common tool that we use. It's probably not something you've ever seen before. If you've ever worked in bird banding, you're probably familiar with mist nets, right? Which are how bird banders capture birds. And we use those too. But these are really useful for capturing bats that have really precise echolocation and therefore could perceive and avoid mist nets. So this is something we do not share with bird research. It's kind of unique to studying bats. Oh yeah, so I'm also monitoring the chat. So yes, the AMNH does have a PhD program. It's fairly young. Its first cohort was in 2008, I want to say. And they graduate 4 or 5 students a year. So it was the privilege of my life to be able to be one of those students uh, through the museum. So where I normally work, Belize most of the time is in Central America. It's just south of Mexico, east of Guatemala. I've also done one expedition to the Peruvian Amazon, which was awesome, but that is a talk for another day. Where I got my start working on bats was right here at home in New York and New Jersey in the Northeast, and that is what I really want to focus on today. But I would be remiss to not show you some of the beautiful locations I've worked, like the Lamanai Archaeological Reserve. That is a 3,000-year-old Maya city where I continue to maintain an active field program. Oh, question from Rick here. They don't get damaged by the monofilament, and the answer is no. So just flipping back really quickly to our harp trap here. So the monofilament is not it's not strung super taut. If you were to go up to the panels and push on them, there's quite a lot of give. So the bats more or less just kind of get a little bit tangled and fall down, but they never come out of the harp trap injured in any way. In fact, it's more likely that they would get injured in a mist net because if they get super, super tangled, if you're not really diligent about checking them, just like with birds, they can cut off circulation to their arms. I've never had a bat injured by the harp trap. So I think this is actually a safer device. Or at least it's less prone to user error. All right. So before any of this tropical Indiana Jones stuff happened in my life, I did not work on bats in these regions of the world, but rather right here at home in North America on the East Coast. So this little guy you're seeing here is a little brown bat, which was formerly the most common bat species in this kind of, I would say, east of the Appalachians area of the United States. And as we will learn in this talk, their populations have declined quite a bit. But back when I first started studying bats, these were still some of the most common species in the area. So just to give you a quick introduction to who's who in the Northeast, the bat species of New Jersey are much fewer in number than the number of species that you would find obviously in tropical habitats. And we're really talking about maybe up to 8 species found here throughout different parts of the year. So all of these guys kind of along the top here, the little brown, big brown, northern long-eared, and small-footed myotis are really quite difficult to tell apart. They all kind of roost in similar caves, and some of these species actually co-roost together. So you can find mixtures of species within one site. I would also include the tricolored bat in that particular in that bin. So all of these guys basically, I would say the top 4 and these 2 along the bottom that all kind of have a similar phenotype are known as cave roosting bats. So these guys are going to find really big hibernacula to aggregate in during hibernation season. And one of their favorite spots to do that is an abandoned mine shaft. So this is actually a situation in which human intervention has actually created habitats that are suitable for bats. So there's not a ton of kind of suitable caves on the East Coast as it is, but these days, if you're going to find these guys, you're going to find them in abandoned mines.
Mm.
So all of them are hibernators, meaning that in the wintertime, instead of getting up out of town, they stay put and they drop their metabolic rates super low so that they don't expend excess resources during a time of year when their insect prey is not available to them. Contrast these guys with our 3 species kind of on the bottom right here, the hoary bat, eastern red, and the silver-haired bat. I think that these bats are just absolutely gorgeous. I mean, look at this Guy Fieri looking frosted tip situation here. It's just beautiful. And these guys are a little bit more difficult to see at night. They're a little bit more high flying, so they're less likely to be perceived at a low altitude. And the special thing about them is that they are migratory, meaning that in a couple of months you won't see them at all. and you certainly won't find them in caves and mines because they do the snowbird thing, like many of us, and they seek warmer pastures in the wintertime. Another special thing about these three guys is that their preferred method of roosting, even when they're here, is to do that under kind of the peeling bark of trees. So if you've ever seen kind of a dead tree standing in your yard and thought, oh, maybe I should cut that down. If it's not in danger of falling on your house, these dead trees called snags are actually really important roost sites for bats, especially these three species who do not roost in caves. So even dead things on the landscape are really important. And I'm sure as bird people, you know that that's true for a variety of reasons. So these are our kind of familiar faces in New Jersey. The other species besides the hoary bat, eastern red, and silver-haired are here throughout all months of the year. The hoary eastern red and silver-haired are only here pretty much from May through October. So why do we want bats in New Jersey? Aside from being really beautiful, they're also really important ecologically. So all of New Jersey's bat species are insectivores, meaning that they eat arthropods primarily. And an individual bat, meaning just one of them, can consume up to 3,000 individual insects in a night. That is a lot if you consider how many bats that there are foraging around in the skies, especially in the summer months. So there's a really interesting study that was published a couple of years ago by Brooke Maslow and her colleagues. She's down at Rutgers, New Brunswick, where she actually was looking to see if bats in New Jersey are consuming agricultural pests or disease vectors. So she traveled around to all these different farms that you can see on the map here, Longmeadow, etc., and collected guano deposits from bats that were captured at those sites. So really interestingly, she found that in the guano or the droppings of big brown and little brown bats at these farms, there were over 160 agricultural pests or disease vectors detected using molecular methods. So basically, you can sequence all the DNA in the poop of these guys and learn about who they're eating. And it turns out that they're eating a lot of things that we don't want on our crops, right? So really ecologically important. And in other places in the world, bats have an even more outsized role in controlling pest populations. So in Thailand, for example, a single bat species that congregates in, roosts of up to several thousand individuals descend out over the rice paddies overnight and contribute billions of dollars of pest control services to farmers that they would otherwise have to make up for with increased application of pesticides. Beyond agriculture, bats are really beneficial for a variety of reasons, and this goes beyond even just here in the Northeast. For example, bat guano or droppings are really high in nitrogen because bats are mostly eating insects, right? So insects are mostly proteinaceous, and whatever they don't digest gets deposited as kind of basic nitrogen components in their droppings. It also has pretty high phosphorus content, so bat guano is actually really highly sought after as an all-natural fertilizer. And this is an image that I literally pulled off of Amazon. You can go onto Amazon and buy a box of bat guano for your garden and even compost the box. So this is really an all-natural product. In places like China, bat guano is actually mined so that farmers who are local to that region can actually apply it to their fields. So this is kind of an interesting, perhaps secret industry associated with bats. Ah, I see here, Kathy said, oh, that explains why it's the main ingredient in Fireball and D&D. As a D&D player, I really, really appreciate that joke. And yes, that does actually explain it. So if you're not really into, thinking about bat guano, that's fine. That's a me thing. I understand it's not for everybody. But something that might be a little bit more palatable is the fact that if you love tequila and mezcal, if you love a good margarita or paloma, you should thank a bat because bats are actually the main pollinators of tequila and mezcal producing agave plants. So this is Leptonicterus yerba buena, also known kind of more commonly now as the tequila bat. And you can see here that the tequila plant puts up these flower spikes that the bats consume the nectar out of. So this species is migratory. It moves from kind of like far southwestern Mexico all the way up actually into the United States. So this species does seasonally occur in the southwestern US in New Mexico and Arizona, and it pollinates agave plants all along that migration corridor that is a couple thousand kilometers long. So tequila bats are really cool. Oops, sorry about that. Didn't mean to flip the slide. One of the things that you should know is that there's actually a bat safe tequila branding that you can buy at certain liquor stores. So what the bat safe label means is that imagine you have these vast fields of agaves that will eventually be used to produce tequila and mezcal. The way that tequila and mezcal works is that basically these tequila agaves want to put up a big flower spike for reproduction. But the tequila farmers prevent them from doing that by chopping off the flower spike so that the sugars remain concentrated in the base of the agave plant, and they harvest that to use it for tequila and mezcal production. The issue is two things. First of all, if you don't let your agaves flower, that means that they're not reproducing sexually, right? Which means that the farmers are basically propagating their agaves from one generation to the next by cloning, and they're all genetically identical. This is a bad thing because if a pest or an illness comes through, it can actually wipe out the entire crop if they're all genetically identical. The second problem is if the tequilas never flower, tequila agaves, then the bats have no food, right? So as they're migrating through this corridor where these agaves grow, they would be kind of constrained for resources at a time that's really metabolically demanding of them. So the Tequila Bat Interchange Project was established to basically be an outreach event to go to farmers in Jalisco, Mexico, where these things are made, and say, hey, if you let 10% of your tequila agaves flower, we'll give you the bat safe label, and you will be contributing to the genetic diversity of your crop and therefore actually protecting it compared to your competitors if there is a pestilence that comes through. So you can get bat safe tequila and mezcal, and I have a couple of uh, I'll drop my favorite one in the chat in case this is interesting to you. Tequila Ocho is my favorite of that bin. All right. So now I think it's important that we maybe debunk some of our misconceptions about bats. This was a great segue. I'm appreciative to Evan for saying maybe we'll learn that we should unlearn some of this stuff. Totally true. So one of the biggest misconceptions about bats when I talk to people is that they assume a lot of bat species are vampires or bloodsuckers. And out of the like 1,500 bat species that have currently been described, three are blood feeders. So they're not super common, and all of them are restricted to Central and South America. Contrary to popular belief, vampire bats are not ugly, horrible creatures. In fact, look how adorable this baby vampire bat is. Check out his gummy little smile. He doesn't even have any teeth yet. I imagine if he did, that he would shear his mother's nipple clean off. So it's a good thing that they don't develop their teeth until after weaning. So vampire bats are actually really cool. They are beyond being adorable as babies. They're actually one of the only animals within the kind of, I guess, small mammal groups that are capable of forming friendships. So within a vampire bat roost, basically the way their biology is, their metabolisms are so fast. Oh, sorry, I see there's actually stuff in the chat here. Are you speaking of human, mammal, or plant disease vectors? Great question, Lee. The answer to that is all of the above, potentially. Bats eat mosquitoes, which are obviously vectors of human diseases like West Nile, especially on the East Coast. And many of the kind of stink bug and beetle type prey items of bats are certainly vectors of plant disease. So thanks for asking that. That's a great question. What do vampire bats feed on? They do actually feed on blood. And the way they do that is probably a little bit different than what you're thinking. So most people assume they have these two kind of sharp canines and they bite you and they actually suck the blood like we think of with Dracula. But that's not actually how vampire bats do it. Their incisors, rather than their canines, are the razor sharp teeth. And what they do is basically make a small nick in the skin of a cattle, like a cow, a pig, sometimes a chicken. And when they do that, the blood starts to flow, mixing with their saliva that contains an anticoagulant. So it stimulates the blood to continue flowing. And there's also some data that suggests that there's like a mild anesthetic quality to it, so that the animal that is usually sleeping, right, because this is happening at night, doesn't feel the nick and doesn't wake up. It would be really bad if you're a 10-gram vampire bat feeding on a 2-ton cow and it wakes up and steps on you, right? So most of the time, their prey are not really harmed from this blood feeding event because if you think about how large a cow or a horse or a pig is, the vampire bat's feeding on about an ounce of blood in a single sitting, which is nothing for that animal. The bigger concern with vampire bats preying on increasingly livestock is that they can transmit rabies through their saliva. And if cattle are not vaccinated, they will have to be put down. And that, creates an economic loss for people in tropical regions that really depend on agriculture as a source of income. So one of the things we do in Belize is work with their agricultural ministry to spread the word and resources about vaccinating cattle. Because if your cattle are vaccinated, you don't need to worry about vampire bats. We really don't want people going out and retaliating against vampire bats because one of the things we've learned working in Belize is that people are really bad at telling bat species apart. So they see a cave filled with bats and assume they're all vampires, and sometimes they're nectar bats or fruit bats or, other innocent bystanders, and they just torch the whole cave. So we're trying to combat, yeah, it's really bad. So we're trying to combat that with education, outreach, and making sure that farmers understand the best way to protect their cattle is to vaccinate them. So that's vampire bats. Hopefully you have a slightly better or more neutral opinion about them now. Um, Another really common modern misconception about bats is that they gave us COVID-19. So this is kind of a complicated scientific story, but basically, COVID-19 did not come directly from bats. What happened is that bats actually host a really genetically similar type of coronavirus to the one that causes COVID, SARS-CoV-2, but that virus is not able to infiltrate human cells. What we think happened is that bats being housed in kind of these open air markets with other animals that they would never interact with in the wild, right? Civets, pangolins. There's no way that these animals would ever come into contact with each other in natural circumstances, but in these kind of traditional medicine markets, they're in cages stacked on top of each other, right? And so in this context, you have animals that are sharing bodily fluids, animals that are stressed. We all know that when we're stressed, we're more likely to get sick, right? So in this context, they're sharing viruses back and forth. And what can happen with viruses is that when you take a bat virus and a pangolin virus and a human virus and mix them all together, they can recombine until you have a new virus that is capable of infecting humans that is basically a chimera of a little piece of a human virus, a little piece of a pangolin virus, and a little piece of a bat virus. And that's kind of what we thought happened here. It's really difficult to tell what that intermediate animal was between bats and humans because they basically burned down the whole market right after COVID took off. So, we have some genetic ways of trying to get to the bottom of this, but the truth is that we may never know what the other species involved were.
Nice.
Yeah. And then this one's kind of silly, but I feel like I heard this as a kid. Maybe you guys did too. Bats get caught in your hair at night, right? This is like the number one thing that people say. Oh, I saw a bat and I ran away because I thought it was going to get stuck in my hair. I think that this is very unlikely. I've had bats pass within 3 inches of my head and never once get caught in my hair. And I got a lot of hair, so I would know. So bats can actually see better at night than we can. They rely quite heavily on echolocation, but that means that they're able to reconstruct a 3D picture of their environment as they're flying. So people, I think, misinterpret bats swooping down towards them as, oh, they're trying to attack me or get stuck in my hair. But more often than not, you're just witnessing them dipping down to catch insects on the wing, maybe under streetlights, tiny little things that you might not be able to see that just happen to be kind of near you. They don't want us, and they definitely don't want to get stuck in our hair. Just checking the chat to make sure I'm not missing anything. Great. So speaking of bats flying around and not getting stuck in our hair, one thing that I did want to give you an appreciation of is just how beautiful they are in flight and how capable and acrobatic they are. So bats are moving around sometimes highly cluttered environments where they have to do these kind of complex aerial maneuvers, much like birds, right? To be able to navigate in often complete darkness. So bats can do lots of different things. They can actually hunt animals on the ground. So this species here, Cretopterus, is a species that's actually a carnivore. It hunts small lizards, frogs, even other bats by basically hovering over them, pouncing on them, and then flying away, which is pretty cool. Then, of course, you have your vampire bats who have their specialized anatomy for feeding on blood, and they can actually walk terrestrially. So, like, kind of like a little Igor situation, they have their little wrists and they kind of hobble around on their wrists, almost like, uh, almost like they're walking on crutches. And then, of course, we have some bats who are even capable of hovering in flight, much like hummingbirds, to feed on nectaries in this case, a banana flower. And I just have to quickly shout out my friends Brock and Sherry Fenton. Brock is a retired 86-year-old bat biologist who now makes it his life mission to take the best photos of bats in flight. And so he comes down to Belize and takes these photos with complicated, like $30,000 worth of light triggers and, staged cameras. And then he gives them to all of the bat biologists who want to use them for science education or publications for free. So thank you to Brock and Sherry for all of these amazing photos in this talk. So just giving you a couple more pictures of really interesting faces and features of bats in flight. And the one thing that I want you to kind of notice is that if you look at your hand, right, it's pretty much the same in structure as the bat wing, right? So here's the thumb, and here are the other four digits. You'll notice that the first two digits along the leading edge of the wing in many bat species are actually fused. And so bats and birds have a very different approach to flight, right? Birds, through their evolutionary history, basically lost all of the bones in their hands, like their digits, their fingers, and reduced or combined many other bones together in what would have been the wrist, right? Bats took a different approach and basically expanded their phalanges, their hands, and these are now the flight control surfaces for bats. So they actually have a very fine control over aerial dynamics in flight because they're able to actually modulate how air is moving across their wings, which are basically like a leathery, stretchy skin. So very different than birds. And the best way to tell birds and bats apart in flight is that bats are much more flappy. It's kind of almost looks like a mammal flying like a moth, whereas birds have a little bit more kind of gliding maneuvers in their flight. Time of day also usually helps with that. Let's see, what else do we have here? Oh, I see. Okay, I got a message asking to address the apparent fact that bats are able to act as reservoirs for so many different human pathogens and are apparently not affected by these pathogens. So that is a really great question and not something I actually explicitly cover in this talk. So I'm happy to give you guys a kind of summary of that aspect of their biology. So bats are really good at hosting particular viruses that are really deadly to humans, but are not seemingly super symptomatic in bats. And the reason that we think they're able to do that is actually directly related to flight. So being a small mammal capable of powered flight means that you have an incredibly high metabolism, right? Think about hummingbirds, right? Incredible metabolism. They basically land infrequently, don't really sleep. one of the metabolic consequences of living at the knife's edge of your energy expenditure like that is that you produce a lot of basically byproducts of metabolism that are really toxic to your own cells. You guys might have heard of these before as free radicals, but they're also called reactive oxygen species. And so basically, these are normal byproducts of your metabolism. In bats, they're producing so many of them that it starts to damage their own DNA and their own cells. And so their immune systems are highly tuned to dealing with metabolic stress and not really spending so much time responding to inflammatory signals associated with disease. So, in the same way that sometimes it's not having an illness that kills you, it's your body's kind of overactive immune response to it, bats have decided not to respond, and in that way have avoided basically killing themselves because they're already operating at that high metabolic level. So we think that that consequence of having a high metabolism and flying has allowed them to tolerate viruses that we could not, right? So if you get infected by Ebola, your body throws every inflammatory response possible at it, and in the process causes a hemorrhagic response that will kill you. Bats have said, we're not going to fight this fight. And therefore, it allows these kind of deadlier pathogens to stick around in their bodies and perhaps evolve in ways that don't happen in other mammals. So this is not to say that bats are like uniquely dangerous. By the way, Ebola and Marburg and all those kind of scary hemorrhagic fevers don't even occur in this hemisphere of the world. They're restricted to Africa. And there are other animals that are implicated in those transmission cycles too, like primates. So most people who get Ebola get it from hunting chimpanzees, not from bats. But we can't really sugarcoat the fact that bats can host some of these deadly things, Hendra virus, Nipah virus. It's just that we haven't fully worked out how that was allowed to happen. I hope that answers the question somewhat. All right, so bringing things kind of back home here to bats in North America. Let's see. Oh, great, perfect. So bringing things back home to bats in North America, bats here face a lot of different threats. Some of these you may have heard of, others perhaps not. So wind turbines are obviously a really important tool in fighting climate change. They can allow us to generate a lot of energy, especially if they're placed offshore. But for the interior wind turbines, so if you've ever driven through like Oklahoma, South Dakota, the vast plains, they often have a lot of wind turbines over agricultural fields. The problem is wind turbines have kind of a negative response for bats. So what happens is when those species, like the three I showed you, are migrating seasonally through these patches of the United States that have a lot of wind turbines, this is when we observe a lot of mortality associated with migration. So the way that that kind of works, people often assume, okay, well, the fan blades are hitting the bats, so maybe if we can get them to avoid the fan blades, they would not die. And it's actually not really so much striking the fan blades, it's more that these blades spin at such a high rate of speed and create turbulent vortices of air that basically compress their diaphragms and kind of choke them. So, like, if you've ever put your head out the window when you're driving really fast and found it harder to breathe, it's the same concept. So there are lots of stakeholders, people in the wind turbine industry, people who work for the North American bat conservation units, trying to work together to try to piece together how we can coexist with bats while still being able to use wind energy. So, for example, do we turn them off at night during the specific times of year that we know the bats are migrating? That might be a solution, right? So, I'm not here to say that wind turbines are terrible and we should stop using them, just that we need to understand more about the biology of migratory bats so that we can avoid the worst consequences for them. Another really big one is just loss of habitat and deforestation. So, like I said, every dead snag in a forest is a potential roost site for bats. And most bats are fundamentally limited not by the availability of food, but the availability of adequate roosts. So, the more that we deforest, the more we are impacting especially tree roosting bats. And of course, if we damage caves and mines or close them and seal them up, we're also removing important bat habitats too. Climate change is another big one. This one's a little hard to measure because every species responds somewhat differently to climate change. So, for example, vampire bats are winning big in climate change and land conversion because every time a chunk of the Amazon is cut down and replaced with a pig farm or a cattle farm, vampire bat populations in that region go up, right? Because basically they have an abundant supply of food. Of course, in other areas of the world, like Southeast Asia, especially the Solomon Islands, other small Polynesian islands, sea level rise is threatening bat species that are perhaps endemic. They only live on that island. And if they no longer have trees to support them because the island is underwater, that's going to be a potential extinction vortex for them. So climate change is a tricky one. Different bat species respond positively or negatively to it. But the one in North America that I think has been most devastating has been white nose syndrome, which we'll talk about more in a couple of minutes. But I can't leave you guys thinking that there's only a bleak picture for bats in North America. Bat Conservation International actually reported that an increase in species recovery of 14% over the last 15 years provides evidence that if we have collaborative conservation efforts, we can change the trajectory for bats. So I do just want to talk about white nose syndrome for a couple of minutes. I'm sure people have probably heard of this problem before. This is a problem that's near and dear to my heart because it's what I worked on for the first 5 or 6 years that I studied bats before I moved into working in the tropics. So what is white nose syndrome? It is a fungal skin infection that impacts particularly hibernating bats. So if you walk into a cave or a mine in the wintertime, you may see many animals that look like this. They're sleeping or torpid, and they are covered with this kind of diffuse white furry fungus, especially on the muzzle, but also on the wings. The fungus in question has a really long scientific name, Pseudogymnoascus destructans. I'm going to call it PD to save, my breath going forward. So PD has been a really devastating fungus, and we think it was introduced to North America from Eurasia around 2006. So the first time it became really noticeable and a problem was a couple years later in 2009, but we have basically been living with this fungus affecting our bat species for nearly 20 years. So just to give you a sense of how quickly and how devastating the spread of this fungus has been, the kind of ground zero for white nose syndrome was actually just a couple hundred miles north of here at a mine in Kingston, New York. So that was around, I think, let me check the scale bar here so I can make sure I'm correct. Yeah, that was around 2006, 2007. People started noticing, who do these cave and mine surveys in the wintertime, these bats have this kind of weird white fuzzy stuff growing on them. And by 2022, this is what the map looked like. So in just a short period of time, we've seen this fungus move from its original kind of ground zero in upstate New York all throughout various provinces in Canada and as far west as Washington State and California. So every kind of dot that you see on this map is a positive identification of the fungus PD at a particular cave or mine in that county. So just because the rest of the map is blank where there aren't these things doesn't mean that PD isn't there. It just means that we haven't positively identified it in a cave or mine in that particular location. But you can see that this stuff is basically everywhere at this point. So coming back to our list of bat species of New Jersey, you may be asking yourself, well, how are these bats faring with this fungal disease? And what I can tell you is that the bats that I have boxed in red here are the ones who seem to be suffering from white nose syndrome the hardest. We have seen their populations decline by 90% in some cases. So for example, the largest bat mine in the state of New Jersey is actually located just a few minutes from where I live in Sussex County at the Hibernia mine. And that mine used to have several 100,000 species or individual bats in it. And now, well, these days I think it has about
That's presentation,
1,000,
live presentation,
1,500.
New Jersey.
So they're not doing great, is kind of the moral of the story. I will say that that particular hibernaculum in Hibernia mine went down to only a couple hundred individuals and has since rebounded to over 1,000 individuals. So like they are getting better. It's just going to take a really, really long time. What can be done to treat or rid bats of white nose syndrome? That is a really good question and something that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has thrown, I don't even know how much money at trying to solve. So initially, people tried to spray some kind of antifungal agent inside the caves and mines to kind of treat the sleeping bats and remove the fungus. The problem is that unless you get 100% coverage, it doesn't work. They continue to become reinfected from year to year. So at this point, the best thing that we can do to protect bats from white nose syndrome is just not disturb them when they're hibernating. They are kind of building a genetic resistance to it over time, but any time that we disturb them, they're going to have a harder time surviving the winter. So the best thing that we can do is kind of stay out of their places. If you go to Hibernia mine, you can't even get in. It's totally kind of gated off, and only the biologists that study that population are allowed to go in there and actually count and interact with the bats. So you may be asking, well, what's going on with the other four? So interestingly, big brown bats seem to host PD, like they have it growing on them when they're hibernating, and yet their populations have not had the same decline. So for whatever reason, they appear to be somewhat more resistant to white nose syndrome. The other three bat species, these migratory guys, remember, they don't live in caves and mines, and so they're not coming into contact with the spores of this fungus that really grows best at a temperature of around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Above that, it doesn't grow at all, and it also needs a certain amount of humidity. So if you are a cave or a mine roosting bat, you're more likely to come into contact with the spores. These three guys that are roosting elsewhere are basically not being exposed. And they're not hibernating, right? They're getting out of town when it gets cold, so their bodies never drop to the temperature needed to support the growth of the fungus. So how does white nose syndrome kill? PD hyphae, which are basically like the root-like structures of fungi, invade the skin. And so you can see here in these histology slides, especially B up here, that you can see these kind of little white diffuse hyphae or fungal roots growing throughout the skin tissue of the bats. And the same is true if you look at their other epidermal structures on the nose, on the wing membrane. They're just covered in these hyphae. The issue with having the fungus growing on their tissues like this is that it basically irritates them and it causes them to wake up more frequently during hibernation than they should. So if you look at this figure here to the right, what it's showing you is basically, at least in the top panel here, how bats handle torpor and hibernation. They don't sleep continuously throughout the hibernation period. There is a period of time where they will be at normal body temperature and awake. We call that euthermia. And then slowly they drop their body temperature until it reaches about 10 degrees centigrade, which we call torpor. Every so often, usually between 2 and 4 weeks, the bats, for reasons we don't quite understand, have to arouse again. And when they do that, they rewarm their bodies back up to euthermia between 30 and 40 degrees Celsius. And that takes a tremendous amount of energy to do. It's like walking into your house when it's stone cold and turning on the furnace, right? You have to burn a lot of oil or gas to get your house back up to a comfortable temperature. So if the fungus is causing the bats to wake up too frequently, that means it's also causing them to burn through their fat reserves well before they're ready to kind of permanently arouse for the spring. And so what we see is that in unaffected bat species, the amount of time that they spend torpid between arousal episodes is much longer if they're not affected by white nose syndrome. If they were killed by white nose syndrome, we see that the average length of time they spent asleep has been sharply decreased. And so this kind of explains why they kind of burn through their fat reserves. And in the early, I would say 2010s, it would not be uncommon to find a scene like this outside of a cave where you have a pile of dead bats because they have simply starved to death. They've burned through their fat reserves, waking up so frequently, and yet there are not any insects around for them to eat in, say, mid-February. So this is how white nose syndrome kills. It basically starves them to death. So again, mortality estimates. These are some more recent data. So there was some data showing that there were 27,000 bats at one time in Hibernia mine, reduced to fewer than 600 within 4 years after the introduction of PD. So we're talking like above 90% mortality rate. In many mines, this is just an example of one. And as a result of the introduction of white nose syndrome, the northern long-eared bat is actually now federally endangered across its entire range. The small-footed and little brown are candidates for listing as endangered. I'm not sure if they have already been proposed for listing on the state list of endangered species or threatened species, but that was in conversation at the time. So this is a pretty sad story, but like Donna was saying, there's still bats flying around at night, right? So why don't all of the bats die from white nose syndrome? Why is it kind of this 90%? What's happening with the other 10%? So on a species level, not all species are equally susceptible to white nose syndrome. So big brown bats get the fungus growing on them, but they don't get sick, and we don't see these mass mortality events. So the question is why? I mean, you can find big brown bats and little brown bats in the same caves, both covered in PD fungus and equally exposed, and yet these guys don't die. So it turns out there's lots of potential explanations for this. What I worked on during my master's thesis suggests that different bat species have skin lipids, oils, that are different, right? So big brown bats have slightly different oils in their skin compared to little brown bats. And we found that some of those oils or lipids have been shown to inhibit the growth of the fungus in vitro, so like on a petri dish. So this suggests that perhaps this gives big brown bats an edge so that PD can't invade their tissues as deeply. It can't use their skin fats as effectively as a source of food, and therefore it colonizes them much more slowly. From the microbiome perspective, big brown bats also have bacterial species like Rhodococcus and Pseudomonas that live naturally on their skin that have antifungal activity, which might also be another kind of balustrade protecting them from invasion with the fungus. And then some more recent studies have also found that unaffected bat species like big brown bats mount a weaker inflammatory response to the fungus, meaning that they are less likely to be irritated and they put up with the fungus without mounting an immune response. So if you've ever had allergies before, you know that like the puffy eyes and itchiness, that's all an inflammation related syndrome, right? Your body is releasing histamine, and histamine signals to your innate immune system to start an inflammatory response. So it seems like the unaffected bat species are simply not mounting that response, and therefore perhaps less irritated, not waking up too frequently. So all this to say, oh, I just saw a question come up in the chat. Oh, talking a little bit about bat teeth. Yeah, Benny, what do you want to know about bat teeth?
I just looked at that bat and I was like, "Oh my God, that's a lot of teeth." Are they are they what are they using their teeth for? Are they using them to chew or are they it's a lot of teeth that they have there.
Yeah, great question. So like this bat here, he's an insect-eating bat. And so yes, they are certainly using their teeth to, they don't really chew in the same way that we do, right? Like they don't actually have molars that are useful for kind of grinding surfaces. Instead, they are more like dogs. They have more kind of carnassial teeth that are kind of thinner and better for shearing. So what they're going to do is basically crunch through the tough exterior skeleton of the insects that they eat and in some cases, they actually pull off, like they do some food handling. So they'll pull off the elytra of beetles. They'll rip off any other bits that are not very tasty and just go for the stuff that they actually want to eat. So they use their teeth to chew, but not in kind of a grinding way like we would assume for humans or herbivores. Um, and also, I will mention, so there are some bat species that have really powerful bite forces, and those species tend to have really short faces and feed on really hard fruits. So there's like this concept in physics of a lever arm, right? Like the shorter the distance, the higher the force you're able to generate. So they have a short face basically to increase the bite force so that they can actually pick really hard fruits off of trees and then carry them away in flight to eat in a safer location. I have another question here from Kathy. As temperatures rise, will hibernating bats spend less time sleeping and be less susceptible to the fungus? That is actually a great hypothesis that I feel some biologists well into the future will be able to test. Yeah, it's totally possible that rising temperatures will mean that insects are available throughout larger portions of the year, and that might actually shorten the amount of time that bats have to spend doing torpor. If that is the case, it might mean that they're better able to clear their infection with white nose syndrome because as soon as they rewarm back to euthermia, that's above the fungus's growth temperature limit and they can clear the infection. So if they survive the winter, they get to live another year and try again. And then I have another question here from Evan, which is also great. Do any predators feed on bats, such as owls? Yes, owls are definitely a huge predation pressure on bats at night. There are also lots of nocturnal hawks, especially in the tropics, that will go after bats for sure. In fact, I think, what was it? Trying to remember the species. There was one year we actually observed an owl capturing bats on the wing and eating them in Belize. I think it was a black and white owl, which was pretty spectacular. So they are definitely predated upon by birds and also snakes. So snakes will hang out at the mouths of these caves where there are these huge emergence events at night and grab them out of the sky and eat them. I've actually seen that happen at Bracken Cave in Texas. So they certainly do have quite a lot of predators. Yeah, crane hawks too. I'm sure that even, a great blue heron would eat a bat if it had one. There's lots and lots of predators that will happily take a chomp at them. So are North American bats doomed? The answer is no, but we still have to treat them very gently to make sure that they have the best chance of persistence possible. There is some evidence that bats are evolving slowly to tolerate white nose syndrome, and some individuals can clear the infection. So you can imagine if 90% of your population is dead, that's an extreme selective bottleneck, right? So there's something about the survivors that is favoring their ability to go on to reproduce. I have another question. In Trinidad, or comment, in Trinidad, you can watch bat falcons waiting for the bats to emerge. Yes, Trinidad is actually a great place to see wild bats. I have a couple of friends who work in Trinidad every year. And, throughout the tropics, actually, it's really easy to see bats. It's not easy to do that here. At night, at dusk, you can kind of see them flying around overhead. But in the tropics, there are so many of them, and many of them roost conspicuously that even in the daytime you might be able to see them and say, oh my gosh, that's a bat. So I highly recommend traveling to those places if you have the opportunity. So why are bats recovering so slowly from white nose syndrome? One of the things that's important to understand about them is that they have a really different life history than other small-sized mammals. So people think that bats are like rats, right? They're flying rats and they must have 40 million babies a year. And that's just not the case. So bats actually only have 1 to 2 offspring, and sometimes not every year. So here's a Myotis nigricans, which is a species that we caught down in Peru. And we actually caught one that was carrying its baby. So you could see the baby's eye here. This is his little furry butt, and this is his ear. So bats only have 2 nipples located in their armpit region. And so the most number of offspring they can really have at a single time is 2, because that's all they have enough to feed. They also have to carry these giant babies around with them that can weigh up to 30% of the mother's body mass. So they're investing an incredible amount of energy and attention into each offspring. And so they are not having many of them per year. So this means that they have a really slow population growth over time, combined with the fact that some individuals will still die from white nose syndrome, and the persistence of the spores reinfecting new individuals every year means that it will take hundreds, maybe even thousands of years to recover to their pre-white nose syndrome numbers. So they're getting there, but it's going to take a long time, and they need our help. And unfortunately, some populations may be extirpated, meaning that the population may go extinct, the species will not, because many of them are very widespread across North America. How long does it take each bat to reach adulthood? Great question from Lisa. So we don't know in 100% of species how long their juvenile period is. We think it's only a year or two, and then bats have an extremely long adult lifespan. So even a bat this size could live 35 to 40 years in the wild. So they spend 1 or 2 years as a juvenile and a pup, have a really, really long adult lifespan, and then if they're lucky enough to make it to senescence, the only way you can tell a geriatric bat is by looking at the teeth and seeing how worn they are. Now, of course, these are wild animals. They usually don't get to live to old age like we have you know, the pleasure of being able to do. But supposing that they don't get taken out by a predator, it's really hard to age a bat because is it 10, 15, 20? They look the same the whole time until they get to the very, very kind of elderly stage of their life. Can you talk a minute about bat reproduction? As mammals, do they give live birth? And yes, Chris, 35 to 40 years is a long time for a small mammal. So bat reproduction, they are mammals, so they do give live birth. This baby that you're seeing in this image is probably a couple days old, maybe a week old. So the way that bat reproduction works is that usually the fathers are not involved beyond, the mating event. Here in North America, how that works is that bats will swarm in the kind of late fall into early winter as they're preparing to go into hibernation. During the fall swarm, that's when mating happens, and females will actually go into hibernation pregnant and give birth in the spring. So most of the time, you will find small patches of bats out in the summertime. They're usually segregated by sex. So some of those little colonies might be maternity colonies, which you can always tell because they're full of babies. And then the males go off into a bachelor colony until it's time to swarm again. Do so-called bat houses the Amazon or Lehman cells attract and provide lodging for bats? Oh, I'm so glad that Mark asked this question because we're getting into what you can do to help support bats. And I was exactly going to tell you about bat boxes. So yes, bat boxes do work, and you can buy them online, but you can also make one yourself if you're quite handy. So there are lots of plans online for how to make a bat box, and they have lots of different floor plans, so to speak, but many of them have a similar structure, which is that they have a roof, and then they have a couple of different hibernation chambers. On the inside of the backboard, there's usually some kind of like hardware cloth or something, just to make it an easier surface for them to hang on to. And in addition to making a bat box, the biggest thing you can do is avoid the use of pesticides on lawns and gardens. This is a bird club. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir because we all know that that's important for birds too. And then, not that I've kind of encountered many people who are active spelunkers, but I just advise people, stay out of caves and mines where you think bats might be present because you never know if you're moving spores around the environment or introducing them to a place that they weren't before. So I do want to spend a couple minutes talking about bat boxes, especially because somebody asked. People often put up bat boxes and get really frustrated because the bats never show up, right? And so there are a couple of success tips that I can offer to you that might help explain if you've put up a bat box, why bats never came to colonize it. The first thing is that bat boxes have to be mounted at least 15 feet from the ground. A lot of bat species require quite a drop to be able to pick up enough airspeed to become airborne. And so if it's too low to the ground, it's not going to be a suitable place or a place that they would seek out to live. For some reason, bats also prefer houses that are mounted on poles or buildings. I think that the reason for this is because, most people want to put it on a tree because a tree is a nice vertical surface that you can get 15 feet off the ground. But the bats might know that the box can be invaded by raccoons and other predators that can climb up the tree, reach inside, and take them or their babies out, right? So they're looking for something that's kind of inaccessible by other animals, which also explains why they love living in people's attics, right? It's a space that you seldom go into. It's quiet, it's dark, and it's high enough that, squirrels and raccoons and other bothersome creatures are probably not going to be accessing their entry and exit hole. So a lot of the times, a great place to put your bat box, especially if you already have bats in your attic and you're trying to entice them out, put that bat box on your side of your house kind of nearby. And then at night when they leave, you can seal up the hole and hope that they come back to the box instead. Another thing you can do is try to regulate temperature. So remember that bats are undergoing torpor, not only during hibernation, but many species use some sort of daily torpor as well, where they drop their metabolic rate slightly to conserve energy. So it really helps them to passively rewarm by taking advantage of sunny locations. So if you have a bat box that's in part shade, you might paint it a dark color so that it attracts more sunlight and heat and helps the bats warm up. If it's in the full sun, you might want to paint it a lighter color so that it doesn't get too hot, driving the bats not to stick around. So I think temperature is probably the biggest factor aside from box placement. Let's see. How many bats will inhabit a box? That kind of depends on what species you get. So if it's a big brown bat, which is a fairly chunky size, you might expect anywhere between 20 and 30. They love to kind of be close next to each other, so you'd be surprised how many can pack in there. Do bats breed in captivity? Some species can be kept in captivity and will readily breed. Others seem to be a lot more sensitive, I guess, if you take them out of their natural context. But a couple of the species that we work with in Belize have been brought back and established captive colonies that are used for research. There's one up at Brown. Someone's doing a study of bats, West Essex wetlands in Livingston. That project I am not familiar with, but I'd love to hear more about it if there's a link to a website. I haven't worked on bats in North America for a long time, so I sometimes have trouble keeping up with all the new things that are happening right here at home. And oh yeah, my most important tip for bat box success, don't be discouraged. Sometimes it takes 1 or 2 years for the bats to move in. It takes time to find your box. And, bats are not distributed evenly across the landscape. So if it takes a couple years, don't be discouraged. Leave it up, check it every year and see what you get. So again, you can perfectly, I think, reasonably buy these things off of Amazon. Just make sure that they're not treated with any kind of chemical pressure treatment type stuff, because that can be bad for the bats as well. If you wanted to make your own bat box, there are a lot of free plans that you can access from Bat Conservation International, BCI. I have a link for that down here. And it's really cheap to do this. It costs about $15 to $30 in materials. If you have a circular saw and a screwdriver gun, you can do this in an afternoon if you want to. And then if you're looking for more ways that you can contribute or help bat conservation, it's always a good idea to support bat conservation groups if and when you can. My favorite is Bat Conservation International. They do a phenomenal amount of work, not only here in North America, but all over the world. And one of the things they do is every year they put out research calls for research proposals from students who are working on bats all over the world and fund their research so that they can actually find out something new and interesting about bat biology. So I actually review proposals from students for them every year, and it's such a joy to see what people are up to in Africa or Australia or places that I have never worked on bats before. Right here at home in New Jersey, Fish and Wildlife does a bat summer count, and they are always looking for volunteers to help with that. This is a really low impact thing to do. If you're not particularly mobile or you have a hard time moving around, you actually just drive an acoustic transect a couple months during the summer, and they give you an acoustic monitoring device and equipment that you basically just like hold out the window and listen for the sounds of bats in the area. So it's really easy. You don't have to go hiking around at night, just driving around. And then, of course, spread the love about bats. They're misunderstood allies, and we need them. So, spreading positive information about them, maybe combating some of these myths if you hear them out in the wild, is a great way to help support bats. Didn't mention the decline in insects as a reason for a drop in bat populations. Yeah, so we are not actually sure about the decline in insects because bats are generalist predators. If there are any insects around, they'll eat them. And when white nose syndrome came through, that was such a devastating, acute crash that that signal has overwhelmed anything we could potentially tell about the decline in insects. So right now, we're just not sure how important the decline has been because white nose syndrome has swamped out that signal in all of the data. I'm sure it is important, but the one thing that bats have going for them is that very few of them are insect specialists. So while the overall decline in insects over many years could be a problem for the number of bats, it will not affect any one species more than another because they'll eat anything they can get their face around, basically. But yeah, that's going to be a major ecological issue, I think, for many species, not just bats. All right. And at this point, I think that's the end of the slideshow, so I'm happy to just open it up to questions and stop sharing so that I can see you all.
Question to get started here, I think. There was a lecture last night by the Linnean Society, and they were looking at the impact of turbines on birds, and at the same time examining the impact of the fracking that's going on. And they determined that the turbines don't have nearly the negative impact that fracking does. I was wondering if fracking is having any negative impact on bats as well.
That's a really interesting question, Sandy, because I'm not actually aware of any studies that have actually looked at that in bats. So what was the mechanism that they found for birds? How is
Well,
fracking affecting the
there,
bird?
there, there's noise, there's flaring of the gas, there's the spread of dust everywhere. They're bringing water in, pumping it out, and that seems to make a big difference. But again, the bottom line was the turbines did have a far less dramatic effect on birds than fracking does. Not to say it's good, it just doesn't affect the birds as much. The
Wow.
turbines.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess the reason is, well, I don't know. Maybe the bat's lung anatomy is just so much more susceptible to this, like, vortex I was talking about. Because when I first heard about this, I thought that it was, bats being struck by the wind turbines themselves, and then came to find out only later from listening to people who work in that field, oh no, it's actually because the air currents are sucking the air out of their lungs and making it impossible for them to breathe. But that only affects migratory bat species during certain points of the year. And so I think that by working with turbine stakeholders to be like, well, can we shut off the turbines at night during, let's say, October, November for a period of a couple hours, and then again in April, May for a period of a couple hours is really helpful. Maybe bats are just more susceptible to that particular pressure than birds, but I don't think anyone has looked into fracking, and probably they should.
Well, are the bats affected by noise at all?
It kind of, I'm not really sure the extent to which they are affected by noise because they, the ones that are kind of hibernating in caves and mines are going to be somewhat insulated from that just by virtue of the fact that they're underground. Crevice roosting bats, same situation. The ones I would be most concerned about are those migratory species that are roosting in trees because they don't really have anywhere to hide from the noise. So that would be the group of species that I would expect them to look at.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions for Melissa?
A lot of them were answered in the chat. That was great.
I have a question. I have a question. How successful is the agricultural changes in Mexico for the tequila and in terms of uptake of these practices to protect the bats there?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So there is a Mexican bat scientist, Rodrigo Medellin, who has made this basically his life's work. He is the founder of the Tequila Interchange Project, and I think that they are working with new crops of farmers all the time. I know it's not a 100% success rate, but with these bats, any amount of flowering agaves is probably helping them, especially down in Jalisco, which is kind of the hotbed for tequila and mezcal production. It's less common the more north you get in uh, in Mexico. But I'd be happy to drop a link here in the chat for the Tequila Interchange Project for anyone who is interested in following up with the really cool work that they do. And oftentimes these tequila producers sponsor the bat meetings when they happen in Mexico. So they donate a bunch of the bat safe tequila uh, to our meetings, which is always a fun time. Sometimes too much fun. You have to make sure you don't have a talk the next day.
Well, I know the hummingbirds are nectaring on the plants during the day. So do the plants continue to release, pollen and stuff for the bats at night?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that tequila and mezcal agaves reproduce is it's kind of like a boom or bust type of thing. So they put up this inflorescence, which is incredible. It's like 20, 15 feet tall, something like that. And they do it once and then the plant dies. So it's up and, you know, the nectar is being produced for a really long time, like continuously throughout the day and the night. But then as soon as it runs out and the reproduction event is over, that plant dies. So they really put it all into reproduction, and many species get to benefit from that. Birds in the daytime, at night, moths and bats.
Quick question. So sometimes I see bats during the day. Is that like when you see a raccoon during the day, that sometimes you think there's something wrong with it. Is it like some bats just are like okay to be out there, flying around during the day?
I would say that more often than not, they should not be out in the day. It does not necessarily mean that they're rabid. Like bats don't really show a lot of outward signs of rabies. They do die from it eventually, but they don't show the same kind of uh, rage or dumb, confused rabies, as they used to call it. More often than not, if bats are active during the day, it's because they've been disturbed from wherever they were roosting and are trying to find a new place to settle down. Anything else?
Do they produce pellets just like owls, from whatever they didn't eject when they were eating their insect prey?
Yeah, great question. So they do not create pellets exactly like owls do, but fruit bats, especially in the old world, like the big flying foxes, will actually not swallow the fruits that they eat. They kind of juice them and then spit out the pulp on the floor, and they call that ejecta. So if you walk around in the rainforest of far north Queensland or, the rainforest of Africa during these giant bat migration events, you might be walking around on some fruit pulp because they don't even swallow it. They just juice it and spit the rest on the floor.
That's why they don't let them in restaurants.
Yeah, they're not super polite, unfortunately.
They're cute, but I didn't know they were so messy.
Oh, they're phenomenally messy. I mean, so one of the things we like to do in the field when we catch fruit bats is they're really nasty. They have a bad attitude and they bite really hard because, like I said, they have those short faces for biting hard fruits. And it's funny because as soon as you put a ripe banana in front of their face, the whole attitude changes. They just go to town on it and flinging it everywhere. But it's amazing. It's like imagine if a giant picked you up and handed you a cheeseburger, right? It's just and you said, sure, we can be friends now.
So do you have to peel that banana for them, or do they peel it for you and you get to watch?
Oh, they're such brutes. They just bite through the skin of the banana. So we have friends down there who live in the village that work at the ecotourism lodge where we stay, and they are forever complaining, "Oh, I just chopped down a spike of bananas. I hung it on my porch and I came out and there's a bite out of every one." So they just bite right through the skin of the banana.
Yeah. There's no places in the world where bats are traditionally kept as pets, are there?
No, I don't think so. So the interesting thing about like cultural relations with bats is that this whole idea that bats are like scary, disease-ridden is really a Western thing. So in the East, you can actually find a lot of really awesome art focusing around bats because in China and Japan, they were actually considered lucky organisms. And in Indonesia and Malaysia, there's a lot of actually positive cultural iconography around bats. So it's kind of only like a Western Hemisphere thing that people are like, ooh, bats. In the East, they're a little bit more cherished. But as far as I know, people don't typically keep them as pets.
Well, I remember visiting someplace in Daintree in Australia,
Hmm?
and they had a rescue bat that would you could put on your arm and it would hang from your arm and you would feed it grapes. Come to think of it, I hadn't thought about that. But I
Yeah,
think it had become sort of a pet.
yeah, so there are definitely species that do really well in captivity. So I would bet anything that you went to Tolga Bat Hospital, which is located in far north Queensland. And actually, the international bat meeting was in Cairns, Australia this year, and so there were a bunch of field trips that went to Tolga. I couldn't go because I was getting married like the next week. So, but yeah, those big flying fox guys, they're pretty lazy in general. Like they're not behaving any differently in captivity than they would in the wild, which is just hanging around, eating fruit, and having a nice time. Other bat species, the insectivores, don't always do so well in captivity. Um, they can be trained to eat mealworms. Pennsylvania Bat Rescue does a really nice job of rehabilitating insectivorous bats that have come into their care. But in the field, like if we offer them an insect, they're too stressed. They won't eat it. So you have to work really hard to habituate those guys to people.
Do they all have their own altitudes? I mean, I don't see any evidence that the chimney swifts are competing with nighthawks, which are competing with bats.
Yeah, so definitely like night foraging bats and birds overlap in kind of altitudinal space, but bats actually do partition the canopy at night. So there are high flying bat species that you will never ever catch in ground level nets because they're 20, 30 meters up in the sky. And then there are lots of bat species that feed on kind of edge forest fruits. And so they're going to be kind of adapted to flying around these kind of low cluttered environments. And that's mostly what we get in our nets. So if you want to catch the high flying stuff, there's a sky net you can set up, but it's kind of a big contraption with pulleys and it's a nightmare. So we don't do it that often.
When
Okay.
you're capturing the bats, what data are you taking, and are they being banded in some way?
Yeah, so I work with a collaborative team of bat researchers. There's about 70 or 80 of us from 10 different institutions. And so the way we run our field expedition is we all go out at night to capture bats, and then we bring them all back to a central field lab where they can be used for various research projects. Some people do behavioral studies. Some people take small tissue samples or blood samples from them to study parasites and pathogens. And then most, if not all of them, will get a pit tag, which is basically like the same as a microchip that you would put in your cat or dog, just much smaller. And we place that between the scapula and the back so they can't, try to dig it out. And so the benefit of doing that, which we started doing in about 2021 or two, is that over time, this effort will lead us to be able to track these animals through their adult lifespan. So if we catch a bat next year, we're going to scan it with a pit tag reader, the same one that your veterinarian would use. And if a number comes up, we'll know it's a bat that we've met before.
Hmm.
So now we can even do long-term studies and say we caught this individual every year for 5 years, and this is how its, I don't know, mycoplasma burden changed through time.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Question. I walk at night a lot and in the parks, and there's usually three or four bats flying. Some of them are very, very low, like they'll just zip right by me. I have long hair. I mean, is this something my husband's like, watch out, they're going to get in your hair, but they're not going to get in my hair, are they? Is their radar sharp enough that they can like just skim my head and not catch me?
Oh yeah. I mean,
They're
they're
not.
no, their echolocation is so precise that
It
they
is.
can
That's
pretty
what I
much
thought.
hear the change in a moth's wing beats and know that it has just veered off to the left, right? So the way I
Right.
try to console people is that they can see you way better than you can see them.
So Sandy, you have nothing to worry about.
I've never worried about it.
Yeah, like I said, I have a lot of hair and I've never had a bat in my hair. I will say that so there are some species of bats that have really narrow wings, which means that they are fast flyers and high flyers. And so they need to get up really high to be able to pick up enough airspeed with those thin little wings to take off. So I've tried to like release them like this on my hand, and they have crawled down my arm and up to the top of my head because it was higher and then jumped off to fly away.
That's funny.
Yeah. It's actually better to take those guys and just literally like softball throw them up into the air so that they get enough kind of on the downswing to take off. But yeah, I've had quite a few mollassids run to the top of my head.
Wow.
But that was my fault. I was handling them in the first place.
Why don't you have any pictures of that?
You know, you would think that these days you have your phone on you all the time, and it's always these little moments when I'm like, I wish I had my phone, but I left it in the lab. They definitely keep you on your toes.
That was a great talk and great questions, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa. That was terrific.
Thank you guys
Yeah,
for being such an
thank you.
engaged audience asking great questions.
Terrific program.
I think we all want to go back to college.
Well, I want to audit your class.
You can
bat-
actually.
That one.
You totally can. It's funny. I try to convince my students all the time. I'm like, I know that these classes seem like a phenomenal amount of work, but you will never be, expected to just be curious 40 hours a week ever again. So cherish it while you can.
For the rest of your life, you'll be the life of the party.
Incredible. Well, thank you guys so much. I mean, I hope that this was fun and engaging for you guys and hope to see you again sometime.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you. It was great.
Thank
I'm
you.
stopping the recording.
All right.
Okay.